It's really an honor to be with you all, and Philip knows this, but probably most of you don't. When I graduated from Holy Cross in '83, and I was the TA for John Cherban, who was instrumental in starting Ocamper. And to be confessional with you, I really hadn't been involved in Ocamper from those years. As Philip said, I went after graduating seminary into parish ministry, did that for 15 years in various parishes in the U.S., but also at the seminary in Nairobi, and would travel to, at the time, Archbishop Anastasios, now Yanalatos, was our bishop. He was the locum tenens bishop for East Africa, and that covered Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Unfortunately, when I was there, the first 2 years, Uganda was still in a civil war. So thank God they signed the peace treaty in Nairobi, and I was able to get in and do some work in Uganda. But many of our people there, really we had not much contact with during those years. And now the Metropolitan of Uganda, Metropolitan Jonah Luanga, had been the deputy director of the seminary in Nairobi, so we worked hand in hand. I was his assistant at the seminary and taught. I'm going to do two things, just kind of help you understand from a contextual experience what IOCC is, and just take about 5 minutes to do that, because especially, it seems like we were under SCOBA and with IOCC and OCMC and all these different acronyms that people get, half the time I'm speaking around the country and they say, oh yeah, we've been to St. Augustine. And I'm like, so have I, but that's OCMC, all right? So just to kind of let you know who we are the official humanitarian aid agency that started under SCOBA. It was actually the first official agency of SCOBA, okay? OCMC actually was part of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese Mission Center. So when I went as a missionary to Africa, it was under the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. When I came back and became a board member of that, that's when it became OCMC. So it was some years later. I was in Kenya from 1985 to 1988, and so OCMC got created after that. So IOCC was actually the first one under SCOBA, and now when they became the Assembly of Bishops, we're now the official humanitarian aid agency. And that's an important distinction, because we don't do mission work, and we don't do mission trips. We do humanitarian aid, all right? And we'll get into a little bit about that. The beautiful thing that IOCC can kind of claim, and we celebrated our 25th anniversary March 10th last year, is we've now delivered over $661 million of aid in more than 60 countries. And I remember when Archbishop Yakovos of blessed memory and the other hierarchs of SCOBA were starting to put this together, none of them thought that we'd be sitting here 25 years later. But we did something very important. We learned from the Protestants and from the Catholics, because the majority of our money is federal money. Now, I say that with this exception. The work that we do in the United States that I'm responsible for, we don't get federal grants. But the majority of the work that we do overseas in those 60 countries is all driven by federal money. All right? And basically we get grants. In the early days, it was all from the Department of Agriculture. And it's shifted lately, really, once the Iraq War started, to the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA. And we've gotten a lot of our grants, and then, of course, with Syria. And we had a footprint in those countries with the collaboration with the Orthodox Church. That's why the State Department and the federal government came to us and said, we need you to work. Same thing in Serbia and the Balkans when that fell apart. So if you looked at our trajectory from a geographical standpoint, it was really in Russia that we got started in 92 when the Patriarch of Moscow had come and made a trip to the United States. And he basically asked the United States hierarchy for help. But he said, we don't need necessarily money. We need expertise. Because under communism, the state took care of everything. But then once the yoke of communism was thrown off, which was a good thing from a democratic standpoint, it wasn't so great from a social services standpoint. And we had a lot of people immediately that had been taken care of by the state, the socialist state, were able then to be free, but a lot of services they enjoyed were stopped. And the church started to step in, but they hadn't done that for how many years? 80 years, okay, or whatever it was. Right? So that was the initial ask, and that's what happened. So we've continued to do that work, and we do that work on a continuum of two types of things. Emergency assistance, which we're a little high, but there it says on top, emergency assistance. And this shows some of the places we do emergency assistance. Thanks. And you'll notice that is a majority. Sorry. Wait, okay. That's the majority of what we do in the U.S. is emergency assistance. So when you look at this map, as it's juxtaposed to what I'm going to show you in a second, you're not going to see any emergency assistance, or you're not going to see any development assistance in the U.S. Okay? So the types of things we do in emergency assistance, what comes to your mind when we think of emergency assistance? Hurricanes, floods, okay? Fires, any natural disaster, but also human-caused disaster. And we're going to get into that in a second. I've spent the last 2 days dealing with the California situation, both with the shooter, and as I think most of you know by now, a 28-year-old Greek Orthodox man was killed. I spent most of the afternoon yesterday talking to his priest, Father John, who's one of our frontliners, is from that area, and he debated whether or not to stay and deal with some of this. At the time, we didn't know that one of our own had been killed, but we knew that it was going to impact a lot of people. And then last night, when two of the frontliners that were there, working with the priest and talking with him and kind of giving him pointers on what to expect from the media and all types of things, as they were driving back, the road, the 101, was closed because of the fires. And they called me from the car and said, we're 6 miles from my house, and I don't know if we're going to make it. As a matter of fact, they didn't make it home last night. They had to stay somewhere else. So we'll get into that. So emergency assistance. And these different places, flooding, hurricane, 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 hurricane. And then when you get overseas, though, we have a lot more of economic type of disasters like in Greece. So it wasn't just the fires that beset Greece, but the almost total collapse. We have the refugee crisis, which they call the migrant crisis, where people were coming from Syria and other places and getting into Europe and then being stopped. A lot of them made it as far as Greece, and that's it. Germany closed their borders. They got stuck in Serbia last winter. IOCC's been doing that type of work. The West Bank, doing work with the Palestinian people, all right, where unemployment was as much as 80% amongst males, all right, going in there with emergency aid programs, all right, food, sometimes psychosocial type of things, especially with children, all right, and we hire people locally. Out of all the employees of IOCC, there's only 4 expats overseas. All the others are local hires, and that's done intentionally. And it really delves into what Dr. Papadopoulos was talking about, too, and having cultural sensitivity, not being the Americans are going to come in and fix them. And unfortunately, that's the mentality of some of our colleagues in other organizations. We know better, we're the experts, and there's something pathologically wrong with you that we're going to fix. So as Orthodox Christians, that's something we know doesn't jive with our theology, but we practice that. When we get to the next one and you talk about longer-term development, so if you look at that continuum, as I said, you don't see that going on in the United States. Longer-term development, microloans, okay, things that get people back on their feet, but also give them the expertise they need to get back to a new normal after whatever trauma, all right, and help them see that with hope. HIV patients, we were doing a lot of work in Ethiopia, big grant. Ethiopia, a place where there's 86 million people and 60 million are Orthodox. A place where there's 300,000 Orthodox clergy and 76,000 churches and monasteries. They call them warido. Every warido has an Orthodox presence. IOCC got grants from the federal government, a PEPFAR grant, which is a presidential grant to work with people living with HIV/AIDS. And we were able to reach 10 million people, even to the point that Patriarch Abuna Paulos of blessed memory would do sermons and he would do rallies in soccer stadiums where 50,000, 60,000 people would come. And he would talk about not stigmatizing people that had AIDS. And this was the leader of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Tremendous impact. The State Department, they were so excited because they'd never had that kind of reach at the grassroots level. That's what IOCC has been able to do from a development perspective. 24 villages on the West Bank getting a $1 million grant from the from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece to do job creation in 4 Palestinian villages, taking that to the U.S. State Department and the United States federal government, and then getting millions of dollars in grants to expand that to 24 villages, job creation, teaching women how to be beekeepers, teaching them how to do other types of skills because their husbands couldn't get jobs. That's what IOCC does on the development side. Microloans, Serbia, Bosnia after the war especially, the Republic of Georgia, on and on. That's the type of work that IOCC is engaged in. But I want to take the majority of the time today and focus in on the U.S. program and then more narrowly on what we call the IOCC Frontline. All right? This actually is a picture, and that's the priest from a little town called Becknell, West Virginia. I think it's Becknell, West Virginia. Is that right? And he brought a team, and we went and cleaned up in Rennell, West Virginia after some flooding. All right? And he was there leading them. And you can see they're a little dirty, and you can see some of what they had to do to pull out because this guy's house got totally flooded. And we had to strip everything down to the studs. But when we look at the IOCC US program, we really try and focus pretty narrowly on capacity increasing of the Orthodox Church. And so we have our own kind of mission for the IOCC program, which fits into the overall mission of IOCC. But the key thing that you see is the church, the Orthodox Church, is our major partner in the work that we do throughout the United States of all jurisdictions. Remember, as an assembly or as a institution of the assembly, it's not any one jurisdiction. We work with all the jurisdictions. And we concentrate especially on disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery. Disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery. Now, one of the things when we were trying to encapsulate what it was we wanted to do, we kind of did some surveys and we talked with a lot of people. We didn't do really focus group research, but we had a lot of interviews that we did. And we came to the realization that many of our people are fairly parochial, that they have kind of an inward-looking mentality. And that gets borne out when I make a phone call to an area like Florida or something after Hurricane Irma, and I say, and I get a hold of the priest and say, "Hey, Father, how are you guys?" "Oh, we're fine. Thank God nobody got hurt." And then he stops. And I'm giving him a chance, because I'm okay with silence as a good counselor, to think about, but what about your neighbor? Unfortunately, that question, that thought, that perspective doesn't enter into a lot of our people's minds. So I prompt him and say, well, have you talked to any of the other local clergy, the non-Orthodox clergy? "Oh, yeah, no, I haven't thought of that." Do you know how they're doing? Do you know how the community's doing? And we start to have a conversation of what we can bring to the table, what are our strengths that we can provide to the larger community. And that's a huge part of what it is that the U.S. program is all about. If we look at a timeline, though, of the major parts or the major things that the U.S. program does, in all honesty, it came out of 9/11. And during 9/11, that was my first week working for IOCC. I started on September 4th, 2001. I went to our headquarters in Baltimore for 2 days to get an orientation at headquarters, and then they shipped me to Bosnia. And I'll never forget being in the village. And at that time, we had these big satellite phones, right? And I was with the head of the office in Bosnia, in Banja Luka. We were in a village. We got a call from the executive director, and we're like, that's unusual. And he starts telling us what had happened. And then he says, "Where are you?" And we told him we were in a village. He said, "Is it a Christian village or a Muslim village?" Even then, he started thinking. And we said, "It's a mixed village." He said, "You need to get back to the city immediately." Nobody knew what had happened. He didn't know what had happened exactly because it was right after the towers fell. Okay. What happened in New York and in Pennsylvania is there were Orthodox priests who wanted to help, but most of them were not credentialed. And so when they went to offer their services, they had their collars on, they had their cassocks on, and like the front line or the first responders, like, who are you? Well, I'm a Greek priest. I'm a Russian priest. Can't you see my hat? Come on. Right? And they're like, thanks, Father. Why don't you go over there? Literally. And the Archbishop said that will never happen to us again. And he charged IOCC as the head of SCOBA to do whatever it took to get our people trained and credentialed. And that was the first U.S. impetus for the work of IOCC. And the first cohort were trained in something called STAR training, which stands for Strategies in Trauma and Resiliency, at Eastern Mennonite University in Pennsylvania. It was a cohort of about 20 priests, all clergy. They were there for 1 week. Eastern Mennonite had, and that program still exists. Eastern Mennonite University had a grant to develop that, and it was really well received, and they went through that training. And then we started to add some frontliners with the idea that the next time there was a human cause or a natural disaster, Orthodox people and clergy specifically could respond. But it quickly became apparent that it shouldn't only be clergy for a variety of reasons. And we started to introduce lay people. And we shifted the model of training from the STAR training to the Critical Incident Stress Management, CISM training, which is what we continue to do to this day. And in the last 5 years, since I was blessed to move into this position, we've now trained another 67 people. So we have 117 frontliners scattered throughout the 10 FEMA regions. We have, and I meant to call my assistant to double check, but I'll say it. I think we have 81 clergy and 36 lay people. All right? They go through specialized training to do this. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's where we got started. But then when you look at this timeline, we formed it here. But Hurricane Katrina really kind of got things going. Because by then, by 2005, people expected IOCC to be responding. And we did. And we did over $4 million of humanitarian assistance after Hurricane Katrina, including sending frontliners there. The stories they tell about going into New Orleans when it was still under martial law. We were the ones who led a caravan of 10 buses from Baton Rouge, from the University of LSU Medical Center. We had our emotional spiritual care people who were being led by a sheriff's SWAT team. Had to go through 3 National Guardman checkpoints, and there was some friction there between the two jurisdictions about letting us in. And we were trying to get to the airport because that was being used as a morgue and the triage center for people that they needed to get out to Baton Rouge. Our guys were there. And it was the first convoy that got in. And they left at about 9 o'clock at night. They did, and it's, if you've been there between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, it's not far. It took them about 6 hours. They got there. I should probably not let you record this, but what the heck. There was a confrontation between the FEMA head of the airport and the sheriff's SWAT team leader, who had brought 10 doctors and about 10 emotional spiritual care people, because they were going to take him back on these buses and put stretchers across the bus. And he said, "We'll get sued. You can't do this because," and the doctors from LSU were saying, "They're going to die. So you worry about getting sued." And he tried to stop him. And this is the best story. This big sheriff, and just imagine a big Southern sheriff, right? He goes up to this FEMA guy, and I'm walking away from this. And he goes, "Son, you see what that says?" And he says, "Yeah." It says, "Read it." And he says, "Sheriff so-and-so," right? And he goes, "Get a good look, because that's the last thing you're going to ever see, unless you get out of the way." And the guy had all this FEMA badge on. "I'm calling Washington," and he starts running away. True story. after Hurricane Katrina. Then the other thing that happens is we start to rebuild homes. Because now it's not just helping them in the immediate trauma of what they've experienced, but how do you help people rebuild their lives and get back to a new normal? That work continues to this day, sending volunteer teams down. We've now done over 40,000 hours of labor, and each hour of labor is estimated to be worth $22.14. So you start adding it up since 2006, because it took a few months before we could do that, all right? That's the kind of work that we do. Then we added a couple years ago, starting to actually do muck out, to clean people's homes out, like you saw in that picture with the priest and his parishioners in Rennell. All right? That was a new thing that we've done. Continuing to grow. Then last 2 years, we had a donor in Minneapolis give us 2 huge like Sprinter vans, like Mercedes vans, but they're the Dodge ProMaster. And we're able to put all the cleanup things in there so they can run a team of volunteers. And they've been deploying all over the world, or all over the U.S. now, after these events. And so that one van just came back from North Carolina on Tuesday. They've been down there in Wilmington, North Carolina, staying at a little OCA parish and running a team of NCCC, National Service Corps, AmeriCorps kids, and Orthodox Christians mixed together, volunteering their time to help people clean up. That's the kind of work that we do. And we do it in the different cycles of the disaster space. And when you talk about disaster, there's basically 4 different cycles. There's preparedness, there's response, there's recovery, and there's mitigation. Those are the 4 kind of quadrants that we look at anytime there's a disaster. As I mentioned, our initial foray was in the response with the emotional spiritual care frontliners. We've started to do some of the recovery work with helping people rebuild their homes. And we work with partners like Habitat for Humanity. We're getting into the mitigation and preparedness phase. I'm actually going from here tonight to York, Pennsylvania, because tomorrow I'm doing a workshop on something called the IOCC Homefront, which is parish preparedness and response training. And especially, you can imagine, and then I'm doing it Sunday in Pittsburgh. You start talking about active shooter situations. You start talking about how woefully unprepared we are to respond, to think these things through ahead of time. Thank God, at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, they had just gone through this type of training, and it saved countless lives. And we know that little interventions, little things like having greeters, can stop these types of incidents from ever occurring. You meet somebody as they come into the church very pleasantly, but you teach your ushers what to look for. That's all going to be in the trainings. When we have a step-by-step 7-stage manual that our churches could be doing. And we didn't make it up. We stole it from the Lutherans. We stole it from the Presbyterians. We're not stupid. These guys have been doing it for 100 years. Just because we're on the old calendar. All right? But let's focus on the front line. And I went a little longer than I meant to. But what is the IOCC front line? As I mentioned, 117 people, clergy and lay people. The lay people usually have counseling backgrounds, social workers. We have a couple doctorate in psychology. I think a few of them are Ocamper members, all right? Scattered throughout the country, ready to be constituted at pretty much a moment's notice and deploy, following certain protocols that we've developed with a team lead. Father John is a sheriff's chaplain. I'm a police chaplain. Okay, we deal with this type of stuff all the time. So we use people that have that type of experience to lead these teams and to go in there in those earliest moments. And we are not first responders. What's a first responder? EMTs, police, fire. And we don't go in there because we don't want to muck it up until they say it's okay to come in. So we work hand in hand with emergency management. We don't go in there as cowboys. I'm from Wyoming. We didn't say that, right? Cowboys, it's a big deal to me, right? We don't go in there as a Lone Ranger. We go in there collaborating with professionals. We go in there like we did last year with Hurricane Harvey, where the Red Cross called me and said, Dan, can you give us a team for the George Brown Convention Center where we have 10,000 people living. Because others had gone to Dallas, but were we willing to go into Houston? Father John was one of the team leads on that team. And we sent 24 people in over about a 3-week period, males and females. They go in, and they're their first people from IOCC on the ground. And they're there to do 2 things initially. A rapid needs assessment. What's going on? What's the ground truth? Not what CNN's showing, right? But get on the ground. What are our capabilities with our partners on the ground? That's one of the reasons why we're going to be doing the home front. I had a situation after Hurricane Sandy where I got a call from FEMA. I was out at Wyoming. My brother and I both played football at the University of Wyoming. So we go out there a couple times a year to watch some games, right? And we were at a hotel in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and it's like 8 o'clock at night in Cheyenne. I get a call from a 202 area code, which I know is D.C., and it's this FEMA Val. It's like, oh, Dan, do you guys have parishes in Brooklyn, New York? Yeah. It's us and the Hasidic Jews. But we're all Orthodox. We have 40 FEMA personnel that their housing fell through. Can you house them? Now, unfortunately, the priest, Father Eugene Pappas at Three Harks, is where we were going to have him stay. He got flooded out of his house, and his cell phone, we couldn't get a hold of him. But my brother had been the assistant priest there for a while, and he had the secretary's number. We're able, because they're kumbadi, they're, right? Because, we're Greek. What are you doing? He calls his former secretary, and they had a parochial school that wasn't being used. Now, there's not a happy ending, or as the doctor said, there's no fairy tale, they lived happily ever after. You can come in. You don't have to stay out there. But we started that, but unfortunately, we couldn't get shower trailers in there, and they had turned off the water to the showers at the gymnasium. But the point is, I want to know next time ahead of time. I want to know what parishes I can call immediately that have that kind of capability, all right? So we send in the frontliners with a scope of work, with parameters, with a team lead. And these are the things they're looking for. We send them in to collaborate with Red Cross, to other health professionals. And we send them in to convert everybody to become Orthodox. No, we don't do that. As a matter of fact, we belong to something called National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, VOAD. Every state has a VOAD, and every territory of the United States has a VOAD. And it is set up to coordinate events amongst all of us so that we don't replicate and duplicate services. So we don't have the Billy Graham rapid response chaplains going in on this block, and then we have the Jewish Neshama chaplains coming in, and then we have the Orthodox Christian chaplains coming in, and this poor person just talked to 3 chaplains in 7 minutes and told their story, and we've re-traumatized them, right? Which I know it's up to them if they're traumatized. Doctor. But, so we coordinate with each other, right? And we say, where are the gaps? Where do you need us? I'll tell you a neat story about the Red Cross shelter after Hurricane. It was the one that hit Houston years ago after Katrina. Rita, right? We have these guys, and they were at Holy Cross at the time. They weren't ordained. They were seminarians. They're both now priests. Father Powell, Barnabas Powell, who does a lot of work for AFR, and Father Jim Karitzis, who was a former chief of police, right? And he became a priest, right? They were seminarians, and they're in there with their cassocks on, right? And the Red Cross lady literally looks at him and says, yeah, you two sit here. And she let them sit there, and they literally sat there. Now, there were people that came up to them and said, oh, Father, pray for me. And they did. But what turned the Red Cross shelter head's mind was when a little kid came near them and threw up. And those 2 seminarians immediately got down on their knees in their cassocks and started to clean up the vomit. And from across the hall, or across the room, she saw that. She walked over to them. She said, now tell me again what you do. They said, we're just here to help. We're here to listen to people. We're here to bring hope. We're here to be a compassionate presence. And she said, okay, I want you to talk to this person. And she totally changed her attitude by seeing that diakonia, that service. That's what we do. They're usually on the ground 4 to 7 days. The good doctor talked about trauma. Here's a nice definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration from the United States. Individual trauma results from an event, and remember we just heard that. It's the event and it results. The individual person decides whether it's traumatizing to them. So it's the event, and then trauma is a response to the event for some people, all right? Or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And that little part about spiritual is a thing we don't talk about mental health much. And that's why it's important for us to be in these places. Because when we go work at a Red Cross shelter, they have a beautiful table, and they have a beautiful sign that says mental health here. So if you've self-identified that you have mental health issues, please step up. And you know what kind of line they have. And then we have Father John and then other guys just walking around. How's it going? What's going on? Playing with the kids, right? Just being available to walk with them. We call that companioning, right? Just walking side by side, listening. Trauma, in the Greek, trauma, it means a wound. A wound. Now, how deep that wound is depends on the person, right? If you look it up in the dictionary, it says a deeply or disturbing experience. The reality is, many times in disasters, people are wounded, just like in life. This isn't rocket science. Things happen. We get wounded, right? Collective trauma, which is a little interesting because it affects the whole community. A blow to the basic tissues, this is an interesting thing, a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. We have an advantage as Orthodox Christians, guys. We have built in ontologically a sense of community, koinonia. All of our liturgical services, everything we do. I mean, my daughter got married a few months ago, and you know, she was all nervous about the wedding invitation list, and you know how it is as parents, and you know, and Dad, we only have this much money to spend. I said, I know. You know, in the early church, there was no such thing as sending invitations to a baptism or a wedding or a funeral. I mean, it's an event of the community. It affects all the people of the community. Yeah, Father John.
My good friend Diane Myers, who wrote that quote that you got at the end there, was talking about community as a vital focus in disaster response way back before anybody was talking about that. The theory being that we are not coming in to bring community. We are not coming in to bring resilience. We are, as an EMT would do, repositioning the airway to help them get restarted, perhaps, by our presence. Doing some very basic psychological first aid. Right. And in doing so, getting them reconnected with the resiliencies which were pre-existing prior to the event.
That's so important. And as social workers, that's because I went back and got my MSW, and I finally had a framework for all the things I knew intuitively or I learned about it being in seminary, is to unlock that. The people have those strengths. And quit focusing on the pathology or what we think is the pathology, right? That's why listening becomes so important. They'll tell you what's important. We might, we talk about presenting symptoms and all this stuff. Ask them. What do they think the issue is? That's what we do in IOCC all the time. Our needs assessments are done with the local people. An interesting story. The first time I went to the airport in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, I was going to do to be at a wedding. And I'm leaving Dar es Salaam. Has anybody been to Dar here? Beautiful airport. And so I'm leaving, and they had all these beautiful big machines. And so I put my bag down for the X-ray machines, right? And the guy goes, "Oh, no. Habana. No. What?" He said, "It doesn't work." So they're hand checking every bag. And I'm like, it looks brand new. He goes, yes, it was a gift from the German government. But when the batteries ran out, we have no money to buy new batteries. So they hadn't used them for 10 years. That's a great white man's solution, thinking we know what's better instead of listening to the people and get a sustainable solution. It's no different in the therapeutic process. Our job is to create a safe space for people to articulate what's going on, to help identify strengths of how they can deal with it, and to walk alongside them and encourage them in that process. And if we're anything else in Orthodoxy, we're about process. That's why us social workers love, right? We're always in process. That's what theosis is. It's moving from image to likeness. Everybody's created the same as the child of God, right? Everybody has that stamp of God on them. Whether we become like God is synergistic with our own will, with surrendering ourselves to God, so that we can become more and more like Him, right? I'm not telling you anything you guys don't know already. One definition, and this is by Kevin Ehlers. Kevin Ehlers works for the Salvation Army, and he's one of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation educators. Okay, he's been credentialed by the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation to do trainings all over the world. This is his definition of emotional and spiritual care in disasters. The emotional and spiritual care provided in times of disaster and crisis is based on an objective assessment of impact and need. Now think again what the doctor said about impact. Impact is personal, right? That's why we say in the disaster world, every disaster is local. We sit there and we become so desensitized. Oh, only 12 people died yesterday at that shooting. And we start comparing numbers. Hey, to those 12 families and those 12 people, right? Only 4,000 people were displaced by this hurricane or this flood. Now, these are real events that people respond to and they choose how they're going to appropriate that in their lives. And I'll be honest. We have on our teams professionally trained counselors. But if you think that the therapeutic process that exists in a Red Cross, shelter, or in the field when we're out there mucking out somebody's home, is what you do in your offices, that's just not reality. The majority of our ESC is done when we're out there handing a cup of water to a fireman. It's with the cops that we were with at the George Brown, who had been working 8 days straight without a break. They hadn't been to their own homes. They didn't even know if their own homes were standing. Go ahead.
And one other thing, one of the few fatalities in Houston that night was Steve, and I'm blanking on his last name, Sergeant Steve Perez, who was on his way in trying to get to work, died that night, stuck under a bridge. And all of those cops who were on the duty, he was much beloved by the entire department, was about to retire, and they had had no time to come together to grieve, to mourn, to have a memorial. They were on duty the next few minutes.
Sure.
And from that point on.
And that's the norm in these situations.
And so one of my immediate tasks when I got there was to walk around and say, I am so sorry about Steve. I wish I'd had a chance to meet him. What can you tell me about it? They would give a 20-second anecdote, cry for 10 seconds, thank me for about 5 seconds, and I'd move on to the next throughout the entire.
So we can look at this fancy definition, but I'm going to skip to the next slide, and we're running short on times, and I want to get through a couple of things. This visually is what it's about. First of all, what you bring is who you are. It's existential. It's ontological. Ondos, right? And the biggest thing that our ESC providers bring is a listening ear. It's not about fixing anybody. It's not about, let me see how quickly I can figure out what your pathology is and let me give you a treatment plan. That's just not going to happen in this kind of a setting, all right? Listening, what you do, cleaning up that vomit, doing things. Talk is cheap. We know that. That's not just a saying. It's a reality, and people see that. Our kids see it. You want to get reality therapy? Let kids talk. They know what's going on. And the smallest one is, of course, speaking. Speak very little. Because, again, we're not going to develop full treatment plans at all. We're going to listen. We're going to identify some of the strengths. We're going to help pull out of them things that have worked for them in the past. And the thing that we do maybe differently than the mental health professionals is we're not afraid to have spiritual conversations, do spiritual assessments. That's why we don't talk only about psychological first aid. We talk about spiritual and psychological, SPFA. And I want to get to some of the differences. There's definitely similarities, but there's some differences. All right? And we train our people continuously. These are the courses. And there's a couple basic courses that anybody who's going to be a Frontline for IOCC goes through. And then we do yearly trainings. And we give them other opportunities for free trainings throughout the country and online trainings. But look at some of these things. Look at the titles of those. And I'll tell you who's benefited the most from a lot of this is our priests. You know why, guys? Because they don't get it anywhere else. They don't get it. We don't do it at seminary. Sorry. We take pastoral theology. But as far as self-care, as far as all kinds of things, CISD, critical stress debriefs, that all the other professions do, okay, as far as, we talk about having a spiritual father, but if you're going to be a counselor, you're supposed to be in counseling yourself, right? We don't do that, all right? We do it in this program. We talk about a PCAID framework, presence, connect with people. That's what Jesus did, right? He met people where they were at. He didn't sit there and say, no, you come to me. I'm going to sit here on my throne as the Son of God, or as God. He went to them. That's what ministry of presence is about. But also to do some assessing, all right? And we'll talk about that in a second. And some intervention. Now, not intervention the way we think of it as counselors a lot of times. Sometimes an intervention is a very simple thing. And the doctor told about an intervention that all his training might have led him down one way, but he had enough experience that he did a very simple intervention that anybody in this room can do. That's what we train people how to do. And to kind of develop an ongoing plan. One thing that's important, and you've maybe seen this before, but in a disaster, there's a cycle, but there's things where it happens. That rescue phase, that's what we're seeing. That's where those stories. Watch CNN yesterday about the shooting. That's what they're talking about. There was no warning. There was no pre-disaster warning. But there were heroic things, and people talked about it, right? And then we have this honeymoon like, wow, humanity is good. Think of 9/11, right? All these stories of New Yorkers, of people in Pennsylvania doing all this stuff, right? And then just like the Thompson J curve, for those of us who understand, who studied sociology, we have reality, and then our expectations start going like this, but reality doesn't keep up. And then there's this drop off here, and we're disillusioned. And then the reality, how am I going to have normal again? And we help people understand about new normal, right? We look at the 10 P's, assessing basic mental health. And again, I'm not going to take a lot of time, but we train our people in this stuff too. All right? Which, as clinicians, as people who do this, that's probably what you've been trained in, right? So we use a CA3 method, right? What's the speech? What's the emotion? The appearance, alertness, activity. Start looking for all those types of things. And then we talk about the 10 P's in psychological first aid. Presence, protection, perception, problem, practical assistance is important. Practical assistance. That's one we fall short on a lot of times in the therapeutic process. We get so up here at this level and we forget, and that's why the Maslow's hierarchy in the slide before becomes important too, right? I mean, you think we're going to have efficacious conversations with people when they don't know where they're going to get their next meal? When they don't know where they're going to stay tonight? I mean, that's just absurd. And on down. But I want to show you the spiritual side of this, though, too. Because we also talk about 7 P's in spiritual assessment. Some of the same. Presence, right? Who you are, just being there. And what, and we're big on this in Orthodoxy. Come with some humility. This is a sacred moment. We don't have a right. We don't have a right as a clinician. The difference is when we're a clinician, people are coming to us, right? So they've kind of invited us in. When you're on a disaster scene and the people are vulnerable, if we don't go into that with humility, can you imagine the damage that does to people? They feel like they're in a zoo. Because who's coming? All the newsies are coming, and the voyeurs, and they're all there. When I was talking to our 2 priests last night that had gone to the area, they were telling me about all the people that were there. And thank God the Red Cross was putting a fence around stuff. Perception, pain. And this is important. It's not what we think. What are they saying is causing them the most pain? We have to be quiet so they can talk and identify it. And we have one guy, and he's a great guy, but he was a Navy pilot. He was a Navy pilot. And man, his brain, he's going to assess, he's going to fix it, and he knows what's needed. And by God, let's get going. Right? He flew helicopters. Right? And this guy's great. But I'm always saying, and he's a deacon, I'm like, slow it down. Let's let them, right? And then I'm going to skip because I want to give you a couple minutes for the biggest thing, and Father John alluded to it. This is like medical first aid. That's what we're talking about. Stop the bleeding. Don't take a bad situation and make it worse. And don't say things like we've heard in the field, like the reason your house got destroyed is you've probably been sinning, right? And God's punishing you. Thank God, not Orthodox people, but we've heard that. The reason this happened to this town of New Orleans is because you guys live a loose lifestyle anyhow. And by God, God is coming, his wrath is upon you. These are real things, guys. Where we impose our perception, we impose our etymology, or epistemology, what was it? Epistemology, where'd the word come from? No, epistemology, right? We got to be careful of that stuff. Our biggest thing is do no harm. And if you don't know what to say, keep your mouth shut. Simple. Especially with the newer guys out of seminary, right? Because we teach them up. And by God, we're going to use it in the field. I got my degree from Holy Cross now. I'm going to go, Christianize these heathens, right? We debrief. We talk afterwards. But the biggest thing we do, and it's in everything, is we listen. We listen. We listen to Jay, who with his little dog had to flee his house because of the river. And he's showing me exactly what happened and how they were waiting and the water got that far from him. He thought they were totally cut off. Right? That was in the St. Louis area. And just like we offered to do with Father in Northridge, California, we said, look, we know that in law enforcement they do critical incident stress debriefs. We don't claim to be experts in that, but we can do modified CISDs with your community, who now is learning today that one of your own got killed. We can help them process this. We can help identify how our own faith tradition can bring strength. We can help you. And like any grief process, there's no shortcut. There's no shortcut. You move through it. But if we move through it as a community, and we move through it giving hope and unlocking the hope that exists within people, because people, remember, as Orthodox Christians, we believe are good, right? And that's how God sees us. And you'd be amazed how therapeutic that itself is. Right? I'm going to stop because I know I'm over time. My wife wasn't in the back corner to say. And Philip is being too nice. But I don't know if we have any time for any questions.
Take a few minutes for questions. If you have any questions, we are right now, we have a transition until we go to the chapel in about 15 minutes. We have to be at the church. But we have time now maybe for one question on the record. And then you're not going anywhere.
I'm not going
This isn't the end of the conversation. So I'll take one question on record, and then we can continue. Otherwise, go ahead.
I was just really fascinated by that list of the seminars you give, the one about compassion fatigue, because that is so true in the medical field, is that we have compassion fatigue. And I'm just wondering, is that something that's available to people that are not necessarily part of the IOCC training program?
Yes. The critical incident, the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation runs these all over the country. But K-Love, which is a Christian radio station, they have a special ministry where they offer these for free throughout the country. And they offer most of the courses that we take. So just go to K-Love, and you'll see, and you click on it, and it talks about all the courses that they offer. And you're absolutely right. That's a huge. We're not good at taking care of ourselves as clinicians, as helpers, whatever. We're out there for everybody else. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.